Roberts. I don't have a title for your talk. Okay, can I get this one?
They're going to be okay. Everybody here? Well, thank you everybody for coming, and I want to thank Tom for his introduction and the other speakers for their very nice talks, some of which presage some of the things I'm going to talk about. Kind of daunting to give the master lecture. Seems like it was only a few years ago when I was the young guy and admiring all of these older guys and trying to live up to the kind of work they were doing, and now all of a sudden I'm that guy. Any rate, the title that I've chosen for my talk is a fairly broad one, and it's so because I wanted to tell you about several different things that we're doing in our lab. The first two involve laboratory experiments with rats and monkeys. And then the third thing that I want to tell you about is something quite different, I suppose, that contributes to my eclecticism or lack of focus, depending on how you want to do it. In any case, I want to suggest that there's been a persisting tension in comparative psychology ever since the 19th century. Most of us know that in the Darwin and Romani's tradition, that in their books, The Descent of Man by Darwin, Animal Intelligence by Romani, that they reported a number of stories which described the intelligence of animals. These included reports on animals all the way from insects to non-human primates, suggesting that they were highly intelligent and that they possessed either human-like intelligence or something very close to it. And of course, this was advanced as support for Darwin's evolutionary theory and his idea of continuity. There was, of course, a behaviorist reaction to these anecdotes and the anthropomorphism that they spawned, and that reaction eventually led to stimulus response psychology, which suggested that animals were pretty much robotic or stimulus response machines. Today, the very fact that we have this conference on comparative cognition suggests that the pendulum has swung back at least towards an interest in animal cognition. And we still, in contemporary points of view, we find some very different positions. For instance, Donald Griffin has suggested that consciousness may be found throughout the animal kingdom. Quite the opposite point of view is taken by the psychologist Ewan MacPhail, who suggests that consciousness is only to be found in people, and in people it's only to be found in adults that have language. Well, of course, the question of consciousness is one that's very difficult to address. But what I want to suggest is that there is another question that might distinguish between animals and people. And I call this cognitive displacement in people. And there are two parts to this: temporal displacement and spatial displacement. So is cognitive displacement to be found in animals? Well, what I mean by temporal displacement is what has already been mentioned as the stuck-in-time idea there is, can animals cognitively or mentally time travel into the past and into the future? And we've already heard both from Nikki and Tom talks on the question of episodic memory, and Nikki also talked about the possibility of animals being able to anticipate the future. So I'm going to talk a bit about some research we've done on that. And then the second part of it is a companion hypothesis, which I call the stuck in space hypothesis. Is it possible that animals are stuck in space? We know that animals are certainly spatially competent, but the question I'm asking here is, can an animal, like a person, imagine other places in space? For instance, we can imagine what's going on outside this room, or in another country, or even in outer space. Can an animal take a perspective on space or visualize space that, from a point of view that is not the one that it is at the particular moment? So first of all, I'm going to talk about research on the stuck-in-time hypothesis. And here we have the case of a dog who can anticipate the future. This dog is Elwood, and for some reason in this talk there's a strange correspondence between monkeys and dogs. But dog Elwood has a dog to-do list, and his to-do list is to eat, scratch, and sniff spikes behind. Okay, so a fairly prosaic to-do list, but nonetheless, it suggests that at least this cartoonist believed that animals can anticipate the future. The next thing I wanted to show you, as all my thunder has been stolen there by Nikki, and that is Robbie Burns had a very different belief about this, and I won't go through the poem again, but the idea was that a mouse lives in the permanent present, and perhaps that was a good thing, because as a human he could look backward on sad things in the past and anticipate cheerful things in the future. So what I want to talk to you about is experiments that we've done recently with our squirrel monkeys. These aren't our squirrel monkeys, Jake and Elwood, but they look a lot like them. Jake and Elwood, by the way, are senior citizens now. They're about 18 years old. They've lived a lot longer than I ever thought they would. I suppose it's because of the fine diet they get and the cognitive experience we give them. But they've certainly made their contribution to science, and they're still going and contributing data. So what I wanted to talk about are, first of all, do squirrel monkeys show temporal myopia? And what is temporal myopia? Well, this is the name to an effect that Silverberg and his colleagues reported in an article in Journal of Experimental Psychology in 1998. And their findings were made with 2 species of macaque monkeys and a chimpanzee. And the effect that they got was very simple. If you offered a non-human primate a choice between 1 and 2 bananas, it would almost always take 2 bananas. No surprise there. But if you kept that ratio of 2 to 1 constant and increased the amount of food, say to 4 and 8 bananas, and offered it a choice, now they showed indifference. They were just as likely to choose 4 bananas as to choose 8 bananas. And Silverberg's interpretation of that was that the monkey chose indifferent, or the monkeys and the chimpanzee chose indifferently because they were showing temporal myopia. That is, when you've got 1 and 2 bananas, you can eat 2 bananas right then, so you want the 2 bananas, but when it's 4 and 8 bananas, all you want is 4 or fewer bananas. So it doesn't make any difference which choice you take. You'll get the bananas you want at the moment. The problem was, he said, that the monkey can't see that if it chose 8 bananas, it could have 4 of them now and save the rest for some later point in time when it would be hungry again. If it can't anticipate the future, there would be no reason to take the larger amount. So we were interested in whether Jake and Elwood would show this effect. And so in our first experiment, we offered them a choice between 2 and 4 peanuts. They like peanuts a lot, so we used peanuts. 2 and 4 peanuts and 10 versus 20 peanuts. And the question was, would they show indifference at 10 versus 20, but a preference for 4 over 2? A second thing that we did in these experiments that wasn't done in Silverberg's experiments was to measure the rate of consumption when they took 10 or 20 peanuts. Did it actually take them a long time to eat that food, which would be in keeping with the possibility that they could anticipate a future need. So these are the results. On the left, you have the choice between 2 and 4. Over here, 10 versus 20. Both monkeys show a significant preference, around 80% preference, for the larger amount. So there's no difference. There's no decline in preference for 20 over 10 versus 4 over 2. In other words, we didn't get the temporal myopia effect with these 4 monkeys. If we look at the consumption data, these are the cumulative number of peanuts that they consume. Over time, you can see that they seem to eat 10 peanuts faster than 20 peanuts. But the important thing here is that it takes them a long time to eat these peanuts, particularly 20 peanuts. It's taking them close to 2 hours to consume all of those peanuts. And there are periods in there where there are actually plateaus, where they may go for 10 minutes without actually eating anything. So that would be in keeping with the idea that they might take the larger amount, anticipating that they would want to eat it in the future. So while that experiment doesn't reveal temporal myopia and is in keeping with the possibility of anticipating the future, we have to ask, is that really strong evidence? The problem here is that suppose that Silverberg had found in his original experiments that his monkeys and chimpanzee preferred the larger quantity, both with large amounts of food and small amounts of food. Would anybody have been surprised? Probably not. We would have all said, well, that's what an animal should do. That's the way they're programmed to forage. Always take the larger amount, go to the larger patch. So simply the fact that animals take the larger amount, even with large quantities of food, may not be the strongest evidence for cognitive time travel. So we decided to carry out 2 further experiments. These involve choice of 2 amounts of peanuts again. The choices are presented in a clear plastic cups. Whichever choice the monkey makes, those are poured into its food bin and it's allowed to consume them. In these experiments, we used multiple baseline design, where an initial baseline is established for the preference for the larger amount. Then an experimental manipulation is introduced, and finally we go back and reestablish baseline. And it's the manipulation that's critical. The animals are tested in their home cages for 1 trial a day. So in experiment 2, we asked, can the preference for the larger amount be removed? The choice is between 10 and 20 peanuts. We establish a baseline preference for 20 peanuts, and then we introduce sessions in which we carry out our critical manipulation. And in this experiment, it's a pilfering manipulation. Whenever the monkey chooses 20 peanuts, never when it chooses 10, only when it chooses 20, the experimenter comes back in to the cage room 15 minutes later and steals all of the remaining peanuts. Now, since I know it's we had to get it past the animal care. Since the monkeys only can consume 6 to 8 peanuts in 15 minutes, they'd be better off to choose 10 peanuts over 20 peanuts. In the long run, they're going to get more by choosing 10 than 20. But they can only realize that, understand that, if they can anticipate what's going to happen 15 minutes into the future. So what happened? Well, these are the results. The golden red bars are the pre and post baseline, and you can see that both monkeys again show significant preference for 20 peanuts over 10 peanuts. However, whoops. Oh, there. Well, you got a little point. You can see that during the pilfering manipulation, both of them drop to a level that is not significantly different from chance performance. So there's some evidence there for anticipation of that future event. We also found some other evidence. We weren't looking for this evidence. It's sort of serendipitous. But nonetheless, we found that both monkeys, on some trials, whenever they chose 20 peanuts, never when they chose 10 peanuts, but on trials when they chose 20 peanuts, when the experimenter went in to pilfer the peanuts, the monkey had taken some of the peanuts and hoarded them on the bottom of the cage, as if it knew that they were going to get stolen, so it better hide some away. Okay. Experiment 3. This is another multiple baseline design. Here the choice is between 2 and 4 peanuts. And we want to initially establish a preference for 4 peanuts over 2. And then the critical manipulation, in this case, is the opposite of that it was in the pilfering experiment. Now the experimenter comes in 15 minutes later, only if the pigeon, only, that's the trouble with doing a lot of different kinds of research. You suffer proactive interference. Only if the monkey has chosen 2 peanuts does the experimenter come in 15 minutes later and now replenishes the number of peanuts. So now the monkey gets 8 more peanuts. The monkey gets 8 more peanuts. And so in the end, it gets a total of 10 peanuts if it chose 2 initially, whereas it would only get 4 if it chose 4 peanuts. So what's the effect of replenishment? The red bars are your baseline. Once again, they're preferring 4 peanuts over 2 peanuts around 80% of the time. Those are significant preferences. But now we get a very strong effect of replenishment. They're actually preferring 4 peanuts over 2 peanuts significantly below 50%. In other words, during that period, they're actually preferring to take 2 rather than 4. So these findings seem to support the idea that the animals can anticipate that future replenishment. So our conclusions from these experiments are that monkeys altered their preferential behavior in keeping with the best future outcome in both the pilfering and replenishment experiments. Choice of the larger amount is not solely explained by an inherited foraging tendency. If it were, we would have expected these manipulations not to have an effect on them. And the findings support the possibility that the squirrel monkeys are capable of forward cognitive time travel. Okay. Now I want to move on to the question of whether animals are stuck in space. Can animals represent spatial layouts outside their current point of view? As I said before, animals are quite spatially competent. Ken Chang talked about that. We know that they can use things like the geometry of a framework that they're in, that they can use landmarks, they can home on landmarks and go directly to them to get to goals. We know they can use multiple landmarks and take vectors from them and compute a location in space. We know that they can use kinesthetic and vestibular cues for path integration. But that involves response to available cues. What I'm asking here is, can an animal represent space that is not immediately present? Or another question would be, can an animal see a space from a different point of view? One of the things that I often ask the students in my class to do as a simple demonstration is simply take a piece of paper and draw a blueprint representation of the place where you live, your house or your apartment. And every student can very quickly sit down and do them, and their drawings are quite accurate. And then I point out to them, but you've never seen it from that point of view. So you can transform your point of view from the one you normally take and still have an accurate representation of space. Can an animal do something like that? Some of us may say that, well, that comes down to the question of whether animals can create cognitive maps or not. And we know that the idea of a cognitive map was originated by Edward Tolman in his famous paper in 1948. And he himself carried out several tests of that question, as did other people. And most of these tests involve the question of whether animals can take novel routes or can take shortcuts. And there has been quite a bit of research on that. But very often a problem arises, and that is that there may be extra-maze cues or environmental cues that could lead an animal to take a shortcut, but wouldn't necessarily require any kind of a cognitive map or overall representation of space. Bennett has pointed this out in some of his papers. So what I want to do is to, well, first of all, here's another joke. This is what it would be like if you're a dog that's stuck in space. For those of you that can't read it, there are two men standing at an elevator. Each of them has a dog. And one dog says to the other, you get in this room for just a few seconds, and they change the whole world outside. Well, this might be what it would be like to a dog if it doesn't understand the idea of spatial displacement. This is a famous experiment that was carried out by Tolman, Ritchie, and Kalish in 1946 that was used to argue for the idea that animals can take a shortcut. This was with rats. I think our batteries are about dead here, but rat takes the central platform. Is there? Oh, yeah. The rat takes this central route, goes around this roundabout route, and eventually comes over here to a goal where there's some food. It's allowed to eat the food, and it's given several trials on that. After doing that, it's then given a test on the famous sunburst maze. And what you can see here is that there are actually 18 paths leading from the central platform, radiating out in all directions. The original pathway is blocked off. Would the rat take routes which would lead off in the direction originally had to travel, or would it go directly towards the goal over here, which would seem to suggest a shortcut? Well, it turned out that the majority of the rats took routes that were close to that which would lead directly to the goal here, suggesting to Tolman and his colleagues that they found evidence of a shortcut. Other people have later pointed out that there was a major problem, and that is that this H here actually represents a light that was hanging over the goal. And that light was there both during training and the testing. And so it's possible that the animal just associated the food with that light, and when given the test, simply homed in on that landmark without having to necessarily have some kind of representation of the overall space. Another famous experiment. Some of you may not know this one, Howard. This was carried out by Seward, reported in 1949. It involves a T maze, and you can see that the T maze is gray with end boxes here which are black and white. Importantly, the rat can't see the color of those boxes from the choice point. The boxes were also differentiated in texture. One had a smooth surface and one had a rough surface. And a number of rats were put at the start and were allowed to simply wander through this maze with no reward in either box. They simply made left turns and went into the black box, and right turns and went into the white box. And after they'd explored it for a number of runs, they were then given the critical test. And the critical test was to take half of the rats, put them directly into the white box, and let them eat some delicious wet mash. And the other half were put into the black box and ate wet mash. But they weren't allowed to finish all of that food. They only ate part of it, and then they were taken out. And now the important test was to put them in the start box and let them go down here and see which way they would go. And Seward reported that about 80% of the rats made the correct choice. That is, made the turn that led back to the goal box where they had been fed. Now, his interpretation of this was in terms of Bullian psychology, so he talked about anticipatory goal responses and so forth. But from a cognitive point of view, one interpretation of it is that the rats had formed a representation or a map of the maze, and therefore knew which way to go to get back to the white box or the black box. But again, we might worry that maybe the rats were seeing some kind of extra maze cues when they were fed in these boxes. He tried to control for that by putting gauze over the maze, but nonetheless, the control may not have been adequate. He himself decided to run a control experiment, and what he did was the same manipulation I just mentioned, except when he fed the rats, he now detached the goal box from the end of the alley and placed it directly behind the start box. Okay, the rats got fed there. Then he reattached that goal box back to the end of the arm, put the rats in the start box, and we want to see if they would respond correctly. And what he found was that now the rats' performance dropped to about 50%. Only 50% of the rats went correctly. In other words, they were champs. Even more interesting, I think, was one rat. And there was one rat that when it was put in the start box here, it refused to go out the start box. Instead, what that rat tried to do was to climb out the back of the box. So this suggests that probably his rats were using some kind of extra maze cue, and so we don't have strong evidence here for spatial displacement. So, what I want to do is to tell you about some new experiments that we've done to test for novel routes and shortcuts in rats, in which we try to use more contemporary kinds of controls for extra maze cues, absolute position in space, vestibular cues, odor cues, and so forth. This is our new cross maze. You can see that it's a cross maze with boxes, gold boxes at the end of each arm. Those gold boxes are differentiated visually. One is white, one is black, one has vertical stripes, one has horizontal stripes. The textures on the floor are different. Rough, smooth, pebbly, I think intermediate roughness, and so forth. Those boxes also have a little light, LED light in the ends of them that illuminate the boxes so the rats can see the boxes. But that, in fact, is the only illumination in the maze and in the test room. And the experimenter can just barely see the rats moving through the maze. The tops of the maze are sanded so that the rat cannot see patterned light through them. And finally, at the end of each box, there's a little hole, and in that hole we put a little piece of cheese, and we cover it with some wire mesh so the rat can't get at it. But that equates the odor cues in all of the boxes. The other thing I want to mention about this maze is that in addition to this cross, there are external alleys that connect these boxes with one another. And we'll see the importance of those in a minute. Okay, so this is a schematic drawing of the maze. And in the experiment I'm going to tell you about, the rats are, let us say that the rats are always fed at one box, or always, this is always the gold box A. Actually, it's of course counterbalanced across all of the different boxes, but let's just say it's A. And we're going to train the rat just with these internal stippled out. So sometimes the rat is put at B, and it has to find its way to A. Sometimes at B, go to A, sometimes at C, and go to A. It gets placed in different start boxes randomly from one trial to the next. But the food is always in this box. The question is, can the rat learn to make the correct turns to get from any one of those three boxes it's placed in to the goal box? Since there are three choices, chance here would be making two choices. These are the results, the acquisition of food location. Indeed, the rats start out around chance, but after 30 trials or so, we can see that they have learned the task. They're significantly below chance. So, is this evidence for a cognitive map or cognitive spatial displacement? Maybe not, because it's possible to explain those findings in terms of the animal learning some response rules, some if-then response rules. For instance, if at B, make a right turn to get to A. If at D, make a left turn. If at C, go straight ahead. So to find out whether the rat is actually has learned something about the overall pattern of the maze, we now want to give it a novel roots test. And that's where these external alleys come in. We're now going to put it, say, at B, prevent it from going down this alley, and give it an opportunity to go down either of these two external alleys that it hasn't traveled before. Will it take the correct path to A? We can also give it a similar test over here at D. Will it go from D to A rather than this route that goes off in the wrong direction? These are the results. since there are only two choices here, 1.5 is chance, you can see that the rats consistently are better than chance. And if we average their data together across 12 tests, it's significantly lower than chance. The problem is, however, that the critical tests are these first two, where they've never run this before, and therefore previous reinforcement can't be affecting their behavior. And while they are below chance, they're not significantly below chance. So we don't have very good evidence there for cognitive mapping or spatial displacement. Here's a second test. This is our shortcut test. Suppose we put the rat at B here, and now it can choose between this route or this route. Notice that this is a roundabout route, whereas the hypotenuse here is the short route. Will it take the more direct route to the goal? We can also run the same test from D. Will it prefer this over this? And these are the results of the shortcut test. They're very much like those of the novel routes test. The rats are consistently better than chance. Their average over 12 tests is significantly below chance, but once again, on those first two critical tests, they don't significantly beat chance. So I think we have to conclude from this that we do not have strong evidence here for cognitive spatial displacement in rats in this particular test. Now, I told you that the last thing I was going to tell you about was something different. So here it is. We go back to Darwin and Romani's. They particularly liked stories about dogs. If you read their books, you'll find numerous stories about the intelligence of dogs. One of their favorite things to report on was how dogs often help people who were in trouble. For instance, there's a lovely report in Romani's book, Animal Intelligence, in which a hunter is walking out on a lake, a frozen lake, and falls through the ice. And it's his good fortune that he happens to have his gun with him, so he sticks his gun up and it just crosses the ice hole and keeps him out of the water. Okay, so he's hanging there, but he can't get out. Okay, and he's got his dog with him, and his dog runs around, sizes up the situation, realizes that he can't pull his master out, and so all of a sudden the dog takes off. And he runs to the nearest town. And when he gets there, he finds a stranger, and he immediately starts barking at the stranger, and then goes up to him and grabs his clothing in his teeth and begins to pull him. The stranger catches on that there's an emergency, follows the dog back to the lake, and saves the dog's master in this emergency situation. Okay? So, of course, you wouldn't hear those kinds of things today. Oh, wouldn't you? Well, here's two fairly well-known psychologists, Roger Fouts and Stanley Coren. Roger Fouts, in his book Next of Kin, while it's mostly about his experiences with chimpanzees, he writes in there about an episode in which when he was a child, the family dog actually threw itself in front of the family truck and sacrificed its life in order to stop the truck, which otherwise would have run over his brother that would happen to be trapped in the road just a few feet ahead. Okay, so a clear indication of the dog anticipating the danger and saving his brother. If you look at Stanley Coren's recent book on dog intelligence, he has several reports of dogs saving people. One, for instance, is a dog who is on a boat with its master, and on 2 occasions awakens its sleeping master as the boat is filling with water. And the master is able to get up and bail the boat out. In another case, a dog, when the house catches on fire, is able to save one of the young daughters of the family from the fire. At this moment, if you're beginning to hear the ground trembling, that's Thorndike rolling over in his grave. To paraphrase Thorndike, 1,000 dogs might be present when somebody is in danger or there's an emergency situation, and they wander around and do nothing. But let one of them happen to wander over to the neighbors and bark and get their attention, and have them come over and see that the neighbor's house is on fire, and that dog immediately becomes a representative of all animals, or of all dogs. Another example here is the Purina Animal Hall of Fame, which every year awards hero medals to animals that have saved people in emergencies, and very frequently those animals are dogs. So I've always been interested in testing the question of whether dogs would actually help people. And the thought I've always had is that we have a beautiful paradigm to do that with. This is called Social Psychology Goes to the Dogs, Bystander Apathy and Canine. Many of you may remember experiments that were done, I think they were back in the 70s or 80s, by social psychologists who were interested in the question, why don't people help out other people in emergencies? Why are people apathetic? So they decided to study this by bringing in a naive subject and having somebody have some kind of an emergency. Something would happen and the person needed help. And of course it was bogus, but the subject didn't know that, and so the question was, what would the subject do about it? I've been interested in using that paradigm to test the question of bystander apathy in dogs, but I never had access to dogs. Well, this year I was hired to teach to direct the honors thesis course in psychology. And one of the students came up to me and said, gee, I don't have a project yet, and I'm kind of worried, and what am I going to do? And I started talking about her with her interest, and it turned out that she is a dog owner, a dog trainer, a dog handler. She runs dogs in shows and so forth. In other words, she's all about dogs and has access to many dogs. So I said, well, I think we can work together. And, her name is Krista McPherson, and it turned out that when I explained this idea to her, that she had actually been thinking along the same lines. Last summer, she was sleeping on the couch in her living room and woke up to find an intruder, a man, standing in her living room. Her dog got up and walked towards this fellow actor, or was he just approaching a stranger as he would perhaps anybody on the street? At any rate, what we decided to do was to set up an emergency, I quote, emergency situation using dog owners and see whether dogs would help their master. So this is our first experiment. This is a diagram set up for our quotes heart attack experiment. We tested a dozen dogs, and we used an open field. It was a schoolyard, And the master walks in with their dog from this direction and walks to a target area. Now what we did was to train these people now to feign the symptoms of a heart attack. So the person would begin coughing, bend over, eventually clasp their arm and then their heart. And finally, the dog owner would fall to the ground and would lie there motionless. And we filmed, we had a video camera here, we filmed what the dog did for 6 minutes. Okay? Now, critically, for 6 of the dogs, there are 2 bystanders. That's what these happy faces are. People who were sitting here and the dog could go to them for help. Or for 6 other dogs, we had only 1 bystander present. So the question was, would the dog go to the bystander to try to get help for its fallen master? And at this point, what I'm going to show you is a video clip of 1 dog. This dog happens to be named Jake, again, like one of our monkeys. But the question here is, do we have Jake to the rescue? This is going to run. This is actually Krista herself, and this is her dog, Jake, the rough cough. See, there's the bystander was over there. Heart attack. We're nominating Krista for an Oscar. So the question here is, what is Jake going to do? I don't really need to show you the rest of the video. That's it. That's all he does. Now, I told you we tested a dozen dogs. Some of the dogs did what Jake did. Some of them sort of continued to sniff around the ground for a while. And some of them went off to the periphery of the yard and barked at dogs in neighboring yards. None of the dogs did anything to attempt to get the bystander's attention, barked at the bystander or tried to grab its clothing or push it in the direction of the person that was injured. There was one poodle who ran over and jumped in one of the bystanders' laps. But as far as we could tell, this was more seeking comfort than trying to get for its master. Now, I showed this to my wife, and she said, well, maybe that's not a significant enough emergency. Maybe that to the dog it's just like being at home and the master's going to bed, they're just lying down. So Krista has recently run a second experiment, and this was taken right out of some of the human bystander apathy work. The dog is brought into, actually into a dog training school where there are several rooms, and is taken into one room where a bystander is seated. The dog's owner introduces him or herself to the bystander. The dog sees all this. And then the owner takes the dog on the leash and walks into a second room. And in that room, there's a bookcase, okay, and it's filled with books. And the owner begins to examine these books and then has an accident. The bookcase falls on top of it. Now, in reality, of course, we trained the person so that, by the way, it's a nice light bookcase. So the person is actually kind of pulling the bookcase over on themselves, but they do a pretty good job of making it look like the bookcase is falling on them. The books all fall out. They're pinned under it. And now the dog owner is actually asked to say, I'm hurt, I need help, Jake or Rex or whatever the dog's name is, go for help, get help. And now we want to see whether, you know, this surely has to be a significant emergency. It's important in these experiments that we test a decent number of dogs, and Krista actually tested 30 dogs in this experiment. We also had a control condition. 15 of the dogs are in the experimental condition I just described. The other 15 are in a condition where the owner drops the leash and then just stands there but doesn't pull the bookcase on top of it. So there's no emergency. So the question is, will the dog help the person in the emergency but not in control? Well, the result was no dog ever went to the bystander to seek help. A couple of the dogs, this being a dog training school, happened to spy the fact that there were some toys over in the corner and went over and started running through tunnels and up and down teeter-totters and stuff like that. But none of them helped. So I think the conclusion to this experiment is that there must be a pretty wide chasm between humans and animals, at least in this particular experiment. And I guess the moral of this story is, if you're going to have a heart attack, have somebody other than your dog around. So that's my talk. Thank you. I don't think it'd be too hard to rig up this kind of an experiment. We just have to be sure to clip their wings so they won't fly away.
Well, to what extent do you think that your evidence for the animals not being stuck in time is domain specific to the charges? Has anybody attempted to look at going on this?
You mean in the monkey experiment?
Monkeys over
Is domain specific? I'm not sure.
it seems to be tied into, from these other point of view, requires the nature of vegetable food. Or whether they might have the social domain some other domain.
Oh, okay. Well, this sort of ties in with some research that my graduate student, Marianne Rakesh-Bondi, was talking about and plans to do, the so-called Bischoff-Curler hypothesis, and that is, when we find some evidence that they're anticipating the future, it's always tied to an immediate need, as it was in these peanut experiments. what she's done is to create a situation where at the time that the choice is made, the need does not arise. The need will only occur in the future, and it's based on the choice that the animal makes. In this case, it's choosing dates, which it consumes and then make it thirsty. And will it make a choice that will allow it to get water a short time in the future? And she's still finding evidence that they're anticipating a future. But with respect to your question, another experiment we have on the books is, what if the choice the animal makes now will lead to an opportunity to play with another monkey in the future? Can they anticipate that, which would be a complete, not even an ingested need, but a social need. And so we're going to find out if that will work or not. Yeah.
On the novel shortcut test and the clusters with the shortcut, was training always starting from the start point always like A, and they always made a right turn to B?
Well, to A, yeah.
Starting from A, so they always made a right turn.
From a given position, yeah.
But the start position was always the same. It wasn't B, or sometimes it was B, sometimes it was C.
Yeah.
Oh.
Bill, in the evidence that you have against, well, insufficient evidence for taking the novel pathways, it seemed to me that the only argument for not collapsing across trial is that there's evidence for learning.
Yeah.
It seemed to me that there really wasn't evidence of learning. And in fact, the only difference between collapsing and using the first day is a lack of power. My guess is that if you use more animals, you would have found a significant effect.
Well, we did use a lot of animals. I think there are about 24 rats in that experiment, which is an awful lot of rats.
What you're gaining in trials is simply more trial. You're gaining finer analysis. So, and it seems, well, it's a little hard to tell, but in a couple of trials it may have gotten better, but in general, it's pretty flat.
Yeah. No, I understand that argument, and I couldn't make it, but I was trying to be kind of ultra conservative. Yeah.
We should talk to her about that. To remember the problem.
Yeah.
It's very clear that your untrained dogs are pretty hopeless at rescue. But there are dogs that are trained to do rescue. I guess that's really a different story entirely.
Well, yeah. If you saw the lead to the slide I had, it said, "Do untrained dogs help their master?" I know dogs can be trained, but they're being trained to respond to certain cues.
Look at Lassie.
Well, yeah.
There's a dog.
Over a week instructor will be effective recovering pain through non-catching. How do you distinguish between that taking the future to delay the pain? I mean, how far in the future they've got to be in order to come outside the video that's being delayed, punishment, delayed?
Well, yeah, I mean, we can go back and go round and round on that question. We know it's been dealt with before, that originally it was suggested that animals can't learn anything with primary reinforcement delays for more than a few seconds. We know there was later findings that apparently they can under certain conditions. I think one of the concerns here is the animal makes a choice and then it's involved in all kinds of other behaviors, and then it gets the pilfering punishment or the replenishment reward. How does it tie that back in to the choice it's made, unless when it's making that choice it's actually anticipating what's going to happen in the future?
Well, the other thing is that the time of recovery of food, if you call it choice, and that gets associated with the food,
Yeah.
then it's not
Yeah.
effective.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. But
I think it's a different problem.
Then you're dealing with selective retrieval. Yeah.
Alan?
Yeah, I'd like to ask exactly the same question to Tonya. Totally unique.
it relates this up to what the Jays do in terms of selectively going back to either a perishable or non-perishable food item, and they have experienced that these things happen. So it's backwards. It's in the same way as this. So,
Well, in our paper, we both accounts. We have two arguments.
okay, so
And we say you need to test it.
And so what's the difference when then since I have this people together and I have to ask them, they don't claim in his talk that their memory for this or their response to these three things is not sufficient memory for the self memory because you have learned rules of what to do. And that seems to be exactly what could be done in the case of the case or in the case of a trained dog or in the case of Tom's can I have a little introduction in that respect?
Go ahead and interact, guys.
Let's do the slide.
Yeah, let's go. One more question?
Yeah, don't people who are stressed smell differently? I mean, would this be a real, like, given what a dog's probably primary sensory modality is, would this fool a dog at all?
You mean if somebody actually had a heart attack?
Yeah. I should say I've had a personal experience when my dog did just this. But what I was wondering is if this might not be a sort of a veridical reenactment as it would be for like people who are more visually oriented.
I really don't know.
You get one question.